welcome back to The Great Game. This is episode 40, our last, or maybe second last, for the year. And we're ending the year on a bit of a more critical, but maybe also thoughtful note, talking about some pet peeves that we've heard from the community. Before we jump in, just wanted to say that it has been a very busy last half of the year for both of us, and so we apologize for not getting more episodes out in the last couple of months. It's been a bit hectic, but there's been lots of good stuff happening. As we go towards the end of the new year, hope everyone is looking forward to a Mega Game full 2025. And we're keen to get a lot more activity going on the podcast in the new year too, including some new episode types and types of discussion that we'd like to try out. So always keen to hear from you all about what you'd like to hear on the pod. And hope that we'll be talking to plenty of you in the new year. Over to you, Jack. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, so welcome everyone. Today we're chatting about Megagame Bugbears, or common problems in mega games. The idea behind this episode, one of the things we wanted to discuss is that if you're a new mega game designer, it can be pretty difficult to know the basic mega game design things that you need to kind of keep in mind. I think if you play a lot of video games, then you really know what the common problems in video games are, like escort quests, like things like that. You know the basic things that people have problems with. If you play a lot of board games, you know the basic design things that people don't like in board games, things like king making or quarterbacking or things like that. Like they have a lot of snappy names for them in board gaming circles. In mega games, it can be a lot tougher. Unless you actually go to a mega game, well, look, obviously you want to go to a mega game, but when a mega game is run, often the only people who really know about that mega game and what the problems were with it or what the good things were with it are the people who went and were physically at that location able to go to it. And after the mega games are very personal things. They're labors of love. No one really wants to go out after the mega game and kind of put it on blast, talking about what the problems were with it, obviously, right?
Well, some people do. Some people do.
Sometimes, yeah. But that can lead to a thing where if you're a new mega game designer, you may not know about some of these common issues that do crop up again and again. So we're going to run through kind of some common things like the equivalent of quarterbacking or king making in board games that do pop up. When we're talking about these, it doesn't mean that you can't include these things in your game. It's just something that you should be aware of, that these things are kind of in some ways fraught or have common issues that other mega game designers have grappled with and looked at in the past. And so, yeah, hopefully it is more of a critical episode, but hopefully by doing this, it'll help kind of broaden the design discussion around mega game design in general.
All right, well, let's get into it then, Jack. Before we started, I did have the thought as you were running through some of the snappy names that there are in sort of the video game and the board game world about the common pet peeves and issues that some of the designers face. Maybe we can challenge ourselves today. We're not necessarily going to be able to fix all of these things, but maybe we can coin some phrases
That's a great idea.
that summarize them all. So we'll see how we go,
Right,
and
fantastic.
then keen to hear from you guys as well, the listeners. If you have better names, I'm sure you will, because flying off the cuff here. But where should we start, Jack? What's your biggest pet peeve in mega games?
Look, let's start with the classic, I would say. This is one that got a lot of chat in our Discord before the episode, and that is council games having no impact on the rest of the game. This is, I think, something that affects a lot of different mega games. It's a classic situation where your mega game has a council, which is an area of the game where a bunch of people get in a room together around the table and talk and make laws and or proposals, or in some way they debate things. It is a area of the game that a lot of people love for good reason, because it is the more role play area of the game. It's the
Mm,
area of the game that's great for people who want to get into character and argue about things and debate things. Unfortunately, if you are in a separate room away from the rest of the game, arguing and debating things, it can be pretty hard to make sure that you actually have any impact at all on the rest of the game that is happening. By definition, if you're arguing about things in a separate room, then you're not part of the main action of the other things that are happening. So you don't necessarily know, as a council member, what is happening in the rest of the game. You probably aren't looking at the war map to see what's going on. You probably aren't looking at the other separate areas to see what's actually happening there.
mm,
So it is easy for people in this council game to become a bit disconnected from what's really going on. In some ways, maybe, I don't know, maybe this is a commentary on the real world as well, but
yeah.
it's easy for them to become separated and to not really know what's happening in the rest of the game. And then it's also easy for the things they argue about and decide, if they decide on a specific law or a resolution or something like that, it's easy for that thing to not actually get communicated into the rest of the game or to be enforced.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and I think this kind of flows into a few other things that we want to chat about today, because often that can then lead to things like players being a bit locked out of being relevant in the game, their actions not making sense or having impact on the game. So I think it is a problem itself, or it can be, but it's also a symptom of a few other things. I do wonder if the idea of the council game itself is maybe a flaw in the design process, and whether or not it is a product of the what we should maybe coin the post Watch the Skies mega game world. I do wonder if the game that sent mega games all around the world via Shut Up, Sit Down had been not Watch the Skies, but some other mega game that maybe didn't have that same sort of three table structure. If maybe council games wouldn't be such a common thing. I know we've talked about it a lot in my local design groups about the idea of the three table game, where you've got the council, you've got the war game, and then you've got a third thing. Um, for example, in Watch the Skies, it's the science. Um, that structure is maybe a trap in itself. Maybe it's the three table structure, the three table trap. Maybe how about that?
Ooh, nice
But
one. The three
or
table trap.
the
That's a
three
that's a
table
good.
trap. And I feel like a lot of people lean into it because they look at Watch the Skies, they look at other things, and I mean, I'm guilty of this. And you could argue God Emperor, for example, does this as well. I think a
Yeah,
lot of the
absolutely.
games that we made straight out of Watch the Skies do this, and so other people starting design might look at those games and say, "All right, so the teams will have this many people, and one needs to go there, one needs to go there, one needs to go there. So what are those three locations?" I think that's a bit of a design trap. So uh, I guess some of the conversation that we saw around this was, I mean, some of the key points that I thought were worth pointing out were some games don't subscribe to that three table trap, and the council
Mm.
is, basically the entire game or a large chunk of it, and it's designed in that way. That can lead to a great council game. I think that the what you were saying, Jack, about how sometimes the sluggishness of the council or the delayedness of its relevance
Mm.
to the game can sometimes parallel the real world, which is interesting as a commentary, but I don't know if it's necessarily fun. It's something that you can pull off through design and have players go like, "Oh, I see. This is why nothing gets done in the real UN."
Yeah.
But is that, I think it's important as the designer to also ask, well, is that fun? Is that revelation worth 6 hours of maybe not having fun because you can't really
Yeah.
impact things?
Absolutely. And it's interesting that there was such a discussion on our Discord about this. We had a lot of people saying cut the council. But I think the lesson I would take away is, if you are making a council in your game, it should not be an afterthought. It should not be something you're just including because mega games have councils. It should be an integrated part of your design. And you should have thought about it and thought about, like, making sure that the people who go to that council do have an impact on the game in some way. I
Mm.
think that there is some designed rule reason why the council will have impact. It's not just left to the players to make sure it has impact, because that can often end up with players have tons of things going on. It's
Mm.
very easy to just forget the council exists.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely not an afterthought. Definitely not an obligation. Don't feel like your game needs to have a council where X number of people go to a room and talk about things. Don't feel like that is required. Don't fall into the three table trap.
Mm,
And I am going to pitch. Don't have a legless council.
mm,
That's my
very
pitch for
nice.
the.
Very nice. That's a good snappy ending to that
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
Next up, we've got a classic one as well: death, imprisonment, injury. It's
Mm,
players being locked out of the game or
mm,
barred from certain important parts of the game. This is a we've had a whole episode on this, so please check out our episode on death in mega games if you want more discussion of this one. But it's a classic issue where someone is, for example, imprisoned and then ends up being forgotten about and left in a broom cupboard for a little too long, or their character is killed and they're locked out of the game, or for whatever reason. Jim Woolman tells a story about this on the Last Turn Madness podcast, where he played a game where he played Mary, Queen of Scots, and ended up spending multiple hours locked in a cupboard. Because in the story of that particular game, Mary did not come in until later in the game, I understand. Look, I think this is a pretty obvious one. And again, we've had a whole podcast issue about this, but yeah, obviously, be very, very cautious about having this type of player elimination or player lockout in your
mm.
game.
Play a lock. I like that. I think.
Mm.
Yeah, I think this is a easy one to fall into. And again, like the council thing, I think it's good. A quick fix when you're going through the design process is to ask whether the thing that you've put in is fun for the person experiencing it, regardless of how much mechanical or thematic sense it makes. I think you need to remember that there are players doing these things. Usually, they're
Yeah.
paying for the privilege. Is it fun for them in some way? I think this also. I think that this could also refer to not so much that imprisonment or being trapped, or people dying and having to sit out, but also mechanisms in a game which other people either built into the game just naturally that will happen, or that other players can utilize, which lock people out of parts of the game. I think I haven't seen a lot of examples of this, but I have heard through feedback that people have felt this way sometimes. Being very wary in your design, that if you're building something in that, for example, gives a player the ability, say, to stop someone else from doing something for the entire game or for several terms or something like that. That's very interesting mechanically and thematically, but you want to be careful about how powerful those abilities can be and what the impact on someone else's fun could be. Just yesterday, from when we record, I was playing So Say We All in Sydney, second run. And in that, I think it was my captain, the captain of my ship, was banned from going to the council for a turn. Well, there's a little bit of background here, but there isn't a council in that game. It was more a meeting of the captains that they would call regularly. And my captain was not invited to it because of pretty obvious reasons. People did not trust us, and that was fine. It made sense. It didn't impact his game all day, and he had plenty of other things to do. If mechanically he hadn't, and it did impact his day, and it was more discretionary that players could just do that with a card or something rather than reacting to something that happened in the story, I think it could have been a much more an unfun moment. So
Mm.
just something to be wary of if you're building those kind of things into the game.
Yeah, absolutely. In the first version of God Emperor we ran, we did have a mechanic where you could bar certain people from going to a certain area of the game, where you could say, the lead general of that table, they're not allowed to go to the war map. They have to go to, the council or underground instead. So yeah, that's not a thing where you're locked out of the game completely. Obviously, you do still go and do things and take your turn. But we found that was pretty unfun for the people who were locked out of the part of the game that they liked or that they wanted to interact with.
Mm,
Yeah, so just, I guess, be really careful about these mechanics. And yeah, obviously, make sure you think about the player who's actually
mm.
doing this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Always consider the player. Yeah, so moving on, there's a couple of other peeves that have come up from the feedback that we got from different communities that similar to this from a design sense. We've talked about players getting what do we call it? Player lock. Talk about player
Mm,
lock. um, but also, there are these issues where player actions can be impacted by the design. So, for example, actions not having a huge impact. Players trying to do something and maybe spending a lot of time trying to do such a thing. And then in the end of the game or at the outcome of the action that they've taken, it's not really doesn't really go anywhere. Doesn't give them anything special. There's no success attached to it, and it can sometimes feel like a real bummer for the player when they realize that they've put a lot of effort in and that's had no impact on the game or their player state or anything like that. I feel like this is a common trap because a lot of designers try to design towards flexibility, letting players be able to create new ideas and implement them and break outside the rules. But then, from a design perspective, a lot of people I think don't know how to design for that, so they just leave everything loose, say that we'll make up an answer on the day, and that can sometimes lead to ideas just getting totally lost. Um,
mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it, the thing you need to consider when you're designing a mega game is that every action that a player takes in a mega game has actually taken them a pretty huge amount of time, right? Compared to, for example, a tabletop game in D&D. I can just go, I hit the orc, it takes 5 seconds, right? In a mega game, that action of like, I want to go and I want to attack the orcs or whatever, I've had to
mm,
go through team time where I've kind of chatted about it, and then I've gone to an area of the game and tried to carry out that action. It could have taken me, half an hour or more to just carry out this simple action. So if that action doesn't have a big impact on the game, or it doesn't mean anything, or it ends up just failing potentially because of a dice roll or whatever, that is pretty serious. It's much more serious than failing one attack in a D&D game or failing
mm,
one action in another game. It's a much more heavy investment of time that people have put into it.
yeah, yeah. So there's no simple fix to this. Like it's easy to say make sure all player actions have an interesting impact. That's hard to do on the day. Um, I think a lot of the time this peeve, this player actions not really having a big impact, can be a product of just the general chaos of running a game and not
Mm,
having time to remember to go back and resolve something in a creative way. One thing I would shout out, which is commonplace, I think, in a lot of the mega games that we're doing here now in Australia, and I've definitely seen it in others overseas, is having the control or the facilitator members solely focused on some of this stuff. So we often call it the plot facilitator now, um, and this is taking someone who on the facilitation team whose sole job is to basically ensure this doesn't happen. Ensure that players who are coming up with things that are a little bit left field or outside the rule book are still given attention, and there's some thought put into what might happen from the result of their actions and how to ensure that that doesn't get lost in the chaos. So I think that's one sort of remedy here. Build it into how you facilitate the game. Make sure there is space in the facilitator team to look at all these like really sort of nuanced actions players are trying to take and figure out, thoughtful and at least somewhat satisfying impacts for them to have.
yeah, absolutely. I guess, I think when you're designing a mega game, it's probably worth just considering that the default result from a player doing something is nothing happens, right? Like in a mega game where you've got 50 people running around, someone tries to do a particular scheme, they're trying to do something sneaky, they're trying to do a cool, interesting plot thing. with so many people running around all doing different things, the default is going to be that that thing just gets forgotten and lost in the shuffle and never ends up happening, right? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
which is not very satisfying. Yeah, so I do think the one of the solutions is to have those player advocates. In the recent run of First Contact, for example, I was the player advocate, or the plot control for a continent which was about four African nations, four or five, I think. And so, yeah, my job was just to make sure that the people in those teams, when they tried to do interesting things or plots or stuff like that, make sure those plots actually felt like they had some kind of resolution and that they were followed through on, and that interesting things happened as a result.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very different to a tabletop game where it's three people and one GM around a table. The default in that is obviously one person says something that will have a big impact on the game. Yeah, so Mega Games really super easy for stuff to get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah. Yep. Um, I think this is also kind of related to another one of the pet peeves that we have on our list here. And I think we've talked about these a little bit in the past as well. And you kind of just touched on one of them now. One being player actions, not just not having an impact, but just downright failing. Like you said,
Mm.
they come up, they spend a turn, maybe more, deciding that they want to do a thing, and then they get to see you roll a die and say, "Oh, sorry, no dice." That's a bummer. Don't design that. I'm gonna take a hard stance and just
Ooh,
say,
coming
don't
out
put that in
strong.
your
Don't
game.
do it. Well, look, I'll talk about my own design. I had
Yeah.
this mechanic in, let me think. We Are Not Alone as the spy mechanic, right? When you try to do something as any kind of spy action, that you put investment into it, and then you roll a dice. You get a bonus based on how much investment you put into the action, and then based on that, you either succeeded or you failed. And
Mm.
I think I would design that differently now. That's one of the things I would change if I ran We Are Not Alone again. Just because, like I was talking about before, like there's just so much more time built into an action. If you're doing that one, if you only get one spy action every turn or whatever, then yeah, that's going to be half an hour or an hour that someone has spent on trying to do that one action, and having it fail because of a single dice roll is it kind of sucks.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
It's an unfortunate translation, I think, from tabletop games or from board games where in those settings the action economy is much faster. So it's okay if you do roll. I mean, I'm still not going to advocate this because I've played a lot of games of D&D where combat is just everyone taking turns rolling dice and failing, and
yeah,
it takes half an hour. But
yeah.
taking half an hour to fight out a fight is not the same as spending 90 minutes preparing for an action and then receiving that die roll and realizing it didn't work. So yeah, I can see where the inspiration for the mechanics come from, but because mega games are so much wider, I suppose, time-wise, and it takes a lot of time to get from the decision point to the resolution point. Usually, then it needs to be slightly more satisfying, or slightly more able to be impacted by player agency.
So I would say one solution to this is just to make sure that there's one solution to this is to make sure that even if that action does fail, at least something interesting happens. They get something out of all that effort they put in. Even if it's something a bit negative, at least if it's like your action had an impact on the game, right? Like
Mm.
that at least is something. I think, yeah, we're talking about it during dice rolls, but one of the things I've kind of reflected on is that the same thing can happen in council games or other
Mm.
games, right? In God Emperor, you can have this proposal that you've thought about and it's really key to your team's strategy and you're really excited about it. And you can go to the court and ask everyone to vote on it, and they can all vote it down, and it doesn't happen, and nothing happens. Like,
Yeah,
like that feels a little bit better because it wasn't just random chance, it was the decisions of other players that caused that to happen.
yeah,
But it still is like a lot of time that you're put in for no game impact.
yeah.
And so if I were to redesign it or go into it, I would try to make sure that at least there is something interesting that happens when your proposal gets voted down in court. At least you get something interesting out of it.
Mm, mm. The other angle there is to better, to build more tools for the players to use to influence the votes.
Mm,
Whether it's to, just giving them examples or more guidance on how to go and negotiate those things, or if there's mechanics built in where they can actually influence the votes. So if there is something that they really want to pass and they know it's going to be opposed, they have an avenue to follow to try to still pass it. I think that comes down to a general good rule of thumb for player decision making in games, giving them multiple ways to do something, so that they're not sort of locked into one type of action that maybe they're not very good at, or they're not prepared for, or don't have the time for.
yeah, definitely.
I think the other point on this, which I think is all wrapped up into player agency. So I'm pitching agency death as the little
Nice.
snappy nickname for this. But the other one is, and this we've talked about this before for sure, not being able to see or prevent bad things that are happening to you as a player.
Hmm.
What's your have you encountered this before, Jack?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so yeah, again, I think often the way these things are designed, like the spy system from We Are Not Alone, for example, is that someone can go and do a scheme or a negative thing. Uh, you They do that scheme against you. They're going to steal your stuff. They're going to blow up your things. They're going to destroy you. They talk that out with control and have, they do the control cost. They get resources. They do things to prepare. They succeed the scheme. And then control comes over and tells you, yep, okay, your stuff has been stolen. And you didn't know that was happening. You had no mechanic to prevent that from happening, or to be able, you had no way of foreseeing that or replying to it or counterattacking. It just happened to you. And again, just because of the chaos of a mega game and the amount of different things that are going on, unless you have specific rules and mechanics and design decisions to stop this, the default is that that's the way it works, right? Like that's the default of how it is going to happen. Is that bad things are going to happen to you. You're going to feel like you're in a tumble dryer, like of knives that just random things are coming at you, and it's going to be rough, and you're not going to have that agency to ideally proactively respond to threats. And like
Yeah.
one of the examples of, I think, trying to fight against this is, again, in our run of First Contact, one of the principles that the Melbourne team there really emphasized was right of reply, which is
Yep.
that when I'm doing something bad to you, that other team that I'm doing something bad to gets a right of reply every single time. It is really critical that, like, okay, you're going to try to steal from Team A. I'm going to go to Team A and see what they want to do about it, right? And make sure that that is kind of built in. Ideally, this is built into the systems and the rules, that there is some way for them to foreshadow bad things happening to them and to react to them.
Mm. Yep. And a good way to do this is to give time. So it's not an instantaneous thing. There doesn't need to be a reactive decision necessarily, but there's a bit of time built into the game for it. I find it's done really well in the Generalissimo is Dead when players are being arrested in that game. It's quite a spectacle. It's quite an exciting part of the game, and it's built into the rules that once the people who are initiating that action have successfully paid for the action, the person who's being targeted they're pulled aside and they're told, and they specifically have a period of time, often up to half a turn or so, to start rallying their defense for it. So it's sort of it's this moment where it is a targeted thing against another player, but it turns the game into this almost mini game where two sides are now forming up, trying to get allies onto their side and prepare the response, which is a showdown of poker hands. I thought that did really well, the right of reply, because it doesn't just assure that the player gets to respond in some way, but it actually builds a whole little mini game around it. And every time that happened in play, when we ran it in Sydney and in Canberra, it became the focus of the game for half an hour, which was really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think this is also something that a lot of mega game mechanics do ideally handle, like in a council in God Emperor, the council game, for example. Like if you vote on a proposal that is going to have a negative impact on someone, then obviously they inherently get a right of reply. You know, they get to debate against you, or they get to vote against it. You know, there's some kind of thing like that baked into the system. I also think this is something where mega games could learn more from tabletop RPGs. I think Blades in the Dark, for example, has a really nice right of reply system kind of baked in, which is when bad things happen to your character, you can spend stress, which is a limited resource. And if it runs out, your character is kind of knocked out for a brief period and could eventually end up being eliminated, and you have to roll up a new character. But you can spend stress to reduce the impact of those negative things that happen to you. And that's just an inherent baked in thing that you can always do when bad things happen to you. And I think having something like this would be a potentially a good idea. It gets really tricky because, again, the more ability you have to negate bad things happen to you, the more you are potentially negating the agency of the person who wanted to do those bad things. So it kind of this is one where in some ways it kind of goes against our thing of player actions not having an impact. But yeah, this is one of the kind of tricky lines you have to walk as a mega game designer: is how much impact should the person who's doing the stabbing and the bad thing and the scheming have? How much impact should the person who is able to prevent them have? You know, ideally, both of these people feel like they had agency and feel like they had a hand in the situation, and that the outcome was foreshadowed to them. They had some understanding, and it didn't feel like it just came out of nowhere and their action had no impact.
Yeah, yeah. And like we said, this isn't we don't have all the answers. I suppose we can't fix all of these design pitfalls that you can fall into, but it's good to think these things through. Like we said earlier, um, the idea of the player lock. Think about player fun and what they're getting out of the game when you're designing mechanics in. Likewise, when you are designing, how can players interact with each other? How can their actions fail? How can how can they maybe break out of the rules and try to impact the game in interesting ways? Think about all of those things and think, what's fun here? How is there a way? If they need to fail, how is there a way to make that interesting? And if players need to be able to, eliminate each other or hinder each other or do something quite nefarious to another player, how can you make that interesting for the two of them involved?
Absolutely. Look, let's talk about one of my favorite ones, which is the economy in mega games. Is a huge thing. The economy immediately collapsing essentially is a very classic mega game problem.
Yep.
You know, when you have a board game with three people, pretty easy to balance that economy and make sure that it all works and it all makes sense. When you have 50 people who are all handing around money and resources and tokens and all of this economy stuff, it is almost impossible to control that. You know, in video games, they actually like hire economists to do this, and
Yeah.
even though for MMOs and for large scale games like that, and even though they do that, the economies in those games still collapse a lot of the time because this is just a really difficult issue. So you know what you find often when this problem becomes present is either people immediately end up with way more money than you thought they would have and way more resources, and you find they can just use all their resources to crush problems easily, and you end up having to balance things on the fly. Each individual control member ends up going, oh shit, I guess that action that cost 2 megabucks. I'm gonna maybe it costs 20 megabucks now. Is that okay? You know, if they have to
Mm.
end up having to kind of rebalance things on the fly to try to bring things back under control. It also, when people have too many resources, you find yourself having a classic problem of running out of money. You know, you're like, oh my god, we didn't print enough money for this game. Like, really, really easy to happen. And on the other side of things, of course, people can end up having way less money than you thought they would. And it
Mm.
turns out that everyone is just broke and they have nothing and they're scrabbling through the dirt just to get a single megabuck.
Yep.
And, you know,
Yeah, I think this is a challenging one. I don't think anyone, like you said, no one has the answer, even multi-million or billion-dollar video game companies. I think my approach to this is to keep things simple, and try not to have. I mean, my approach in the past, to be honest, is to try not to have an economy that can be broken.
yeah.
Try to keep things simple. Have as few resources as possible. Understand how they interact with each other, but also, rather than trying to find balance, my focus is usually more on two things. One is the levers and the sinks, the way that you can bring things into the game and remove them if you need to, from like a facilitation perspective. And the second thing is how can you, I guess maybe foresee creative ways for players to use certain resources, so that if they do end up with too many of them, you can sort of nudge them in a direction that will let them use them for a meaningful thing. This
Mm.
actually happened. This exactly thing happened yesterday with So Say We All, a game of survival on the spaceship fleet that's trying to outrun the enemy, and we just had so much food. My pockets were full of food all day. Um, my ship's identity was the food people. There were two of us in the fleet, but after turn 1 or 2, there were four, and no one needed food. Everyone had too much food. So we had to get creative, and we had exactly that issue you were saying, Jack, where I started getting bits of cardboard from the facilitators saying this is
Yep.
worth 10 food.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, so and there's nothing wrong with that, and it was fun, and it didn't impact the game negatively for us at all. But we did start, doing a lot of underhanded schemes and justifying how they were paid for with food and that kind of thing. And so
Mm.
some flexibility in what the resources mean is always good. I think
Yep.
that's why I often find myself leaning towards um, much more abstracted resources these days. Things like clout or influence, or not dollars, not meals, not
Yeah.
bits of wood. Sometimes you need that nuance, but I feel like it's a bit of an economic trap because of the reasons that we've just
Mm.
said.
Absolutely. And I guess it's worth reiterating what we said at the start is that, we want to tell you that these are common things that happen in mega games. That doesn't mean you can still go, that's okay. I'm okay with having this in my game, right? I think the way this often plays out in my experience, in the classic, we are not alone, watch the skies kind of model, is that all of the countries end up being extremely rich and having
Mm.
tons of money, and that means they pour all that money into wild plots and schemes and wacky ideas. And because they're pouring all that money in, those plots and schemes and ideas are succeeding. Like, they're gonna happen, they're gonna succeed. And so by the end of the game, people are able to do a lot of wacky, fun
Mm.
things. So it's not actually inherently bad. It feels kind of fun, like that you're like, oh my god, we're so rich and we're able to do all this cool fun stuff. So, like,
Mm.
yeah, if that is the vibe that suits your mega game, then there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just if your mega game is based around, like, ooh, this is a mega game about surviving in the apocalypse and we're meant to be scrabbling for every dollar,
Yeah.
then you probably want to think about this one. And
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, the way I usually solve it is to try to just get rid of money, like just not have money in the
Yeah.
game,
Yeah.
have it very restricted. Like in
Yeah.
God Emperor, there is no money, there is no gold. Your resources are your people. Each individual person is the main resource. And, because of the way the teams work, you start with 5 people and you end the game with 5 people. So that resource is always meaningful. It never changes. It's always going to be a really important and meaningful decision. You're not going to end up in a situation where the economy breaks and you suddenly have 20 people on your team. Like, that's not part of the game.
Yeah.
So I think considering things like that, or in We Are Not Alone, I also had a very restricted economy, like where I think the way it works is that you get around 5 megabucks per turn, very small numbers. If you're a really rich nation, you might get 6 or 7 megabucks. If you're a poor nation, you might get 3 or 4 megabucks. So it's like very restricted, very tight numbers, and that
Mm.
I think did end up helping a bit and helping things to not go completely out of control by the end. But yeah, it's all about what kind of vibe you want to create.
Yeah. I think a common fix for this in board games is physically limiting what's in the game. So you'll often
Mm,
encounter those games that say, once you run out of the little red tokens on the board, there aren't any more, and you can't get any more
yeah,
until some go back into the bank. That's
yeah,
something I've tried. I think a lot of mega games have tried with As the Fire Dies. We had Manpower, which was basically the worker placement part of the game, and there were ways for them, the new worker tokens, to come into the game, which were facilitator driven, but then they could also leave the game through the way that they interacted with the mechanics. Workers would leave or get killed or that kind of thing. But generally, there was a pool of them, and that's all that existed. And the players knew that. And between their teams, they could change how many they get each turn of that pool. But ultimately, they knew that there was, 150, and that was all there was. So that's one way to automatically balance an economy. The risk to that is if the players have too much control over that, then you can quickly end up with players or teams that don't have any because they've been locked out of it somehow. So I think flexibility is important, but having a closed economy like that can sometimes help.
mm. Yeah. Speaking of closed economies, it's probably worth mentioning them specifically because they
Mm.
can really go out of control in the mega game. The problem with a closed economy is that in a board, so closed economies, for those who don't know, is when instead of putting new money into the system from the bank as income each turn. The players start with a certain amount of money, and that's all the money that exists. It just goes around between the different players, but it never leaves the system, and new money never enters the system. The In a board game, this is great, and I love it. In a board game, you can very easily look across the table and see, okay, my opponent over there has gotten all the money and is hoarding it all, and that's why we're all super poor and scrabbling through the dirt to try to get an advantage. And so we can look across the table at that rich player and go, let's all get rid of that person so that we get all their money, you know? In a mega game, that is not so easy to do. If the money is being drained out of the system by one particular player or one subset of players, that money is probably in their pockets where no one else can see it. And so it's pretty easy to go, okay, everyone's really poor. Why is everyone so poor? Like, it's such a complicated system. It's 50 players, you have a really hard time figuring out what is happening here and why the economy has done this weird thing. And so it's very hard for players to feel like, oh, I just need to go to that rich person and beat them up and take their money in order to get back into the system. Like it's they don't necessarily know that that's what's happening. And the problem is, it's not easy to fix when it's happening either. If you have a system where one person is hoarding all of the money and everyone else is dirt poor, if you put more money into the system, it's just going to end up going to that super rich person and they're going to hoard even more money. So like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just it is harder for players to understand why the economy stuff is happening and feel like they can address it than it is in a board game. So that's why closed economies can be a bit of a fraught thing, even though I
Yeah.
really love them.
Yeah. Which is what I've encountered in any mega game that has had it. I think the underlying lesson here for me, the design lesson, is try to keep it simple and try
Mm,
to keep it flexible. Try to, as much as you don't want your economy to be one of those parts of the game where players feel like you're just making it all up, be able to make it up a little bit. Be able to pull levers and press buttons that help balance it as you go.
sure.
Um, I don't have a quippy name for this one. all I could think of was gold rushing, but that
Gold
only
rushing, I do love that. Or
it doesn't
geez,
account for the one where you run out of things, but still.
gold rushing is good. I don't know, some name of like billionairing, like something where just
Mm,
everyone is richer than God. Like that's a good
yeah,
name for it.
yeah,
Economy
yeah.
collapse. I don't know.
The broken dollar.
Inflation.
Um, this kind of bounces into another one which came up in some of the feedback when we went and asked you all what your pet peeves were. We did get one about consistency in how rules are adjudicated, and I think this I'm connecting it to the economy point because we have in Sydney we often, as part of our sort of prep and induction and training of new facilitators is to talk about decision shopping, which is something that we don't encounter that often, but we have sometimes. And that's where players have a thing that they want to do. Usually it's something that's not in the rules, so it needs a bit of interpretation. And they go around to several different facilitators to ask them the same question, and they try to find the best answer. Who's going to give it to them cheapest, who's going to give them the best outcome. So it comes down to the fact that the facilitators are all individual people. They're going to use discretion differently, make decisions differently. And so people are, I guess, trying to abuse that system and find the right outcome. Um, Facilitator consistency in general is quite hard. We have to, everyone thinks and operates differently. They make decisions differently. They apply their discretion differently. It's something that is worth considering, I suppose, in the design of your game. What kinds of things do you need to equip the facilitators with to be able to make decisions? Things like cheat sheets, conversion tables, maybe rough guides to. One thing that I've tried to do in the past in a few games is have a table for decision making on, crazy player ideas where it sort of says what is the impact, how wide is the impact of the action, and then some of the things in that column could be like it's only going to slightly benefit the person that's doing it. The next tier could be it's going to impact their team or it's going to impact another individual. The next tier could be it's going to impact a major part of the game, and then the highest tier could be it's going to drastically change the entire game state. And then once you have that scale, you can then start to apply some example values or costs to those things. It's not foolproof, but it gives everyone facilitating the game a bit of a guide to work off. You'll never get, 10, 12, or, for some of the very large games, 50 people who are facilitating a mega game all on the same page and able to make the exact same decision. So there's always needs to be flexibility and understanding from players on this. But it is something to keep in mind when you're designing the game, and particularly the components, the materials that you're giving the facilitators to help them do their job.
Absolutely. And I think this is one that comes up more and more the more narrative-y and the more rules
Mm,
light your game is. If you are making a quite mechanical, crunchy mega game, then obviously the rules are kind of handling the impact of being consistent, right? It's like, okay, if this particular action does 2 damage, it does 2 damage. The facilitators don't need to weigh in on that one.
mm,
But if you have a more, when you have your areas of the game that are more rules light and woolly and people can make up whatever they want to do, then it starts to become more and more about interpretation and how much exactly should this thing cost becomes an important thing that facilitators need to consider. So this is something I've thought a lot about in my game Neverwood, which is very much that style of rules light, narrative-y, improvisational type of game. And in those games, there is a lot of leeway for the facilitators to decide how things go. One of the mechanics in my game, for example, is that your action can succeed with a consequence, which is a classic thing I've seen in a few mega games. Where you do the thing you wanted to do, but you also get some kind of twist or complication or consequence of some kind. And deciding what that consequence should be is pretty important, and it's very much up to interpretation in a lot of games. You can easily find yourself going, okay, listen, you say that my action succeeds, but I stub my toe, and this other facilitator says my action succeeds, but I break every limb in my body. Okay, I'll go with this guy. I'll go with the one who says I'm just stubbing my toe.
Mm.
So one of the things I'm trying to do is offload that onto the rules of the game themselves. Is that there are set consequences. There's essentially a deck of cards in each clearing, and when you do an action that succeeds with a consequence, you draw the top card of that deck, which tells you what the consequence is. And the consequences get worse and worse and worse as you go down that deck as the game goes on. So there is a natural cadence where things get more intense as the game goes on and as things get closer to a conclusion. But essentially, what I'm trying out with this is, the game is handling that work of what should the consequences be, how should things be ruled, because it is so hard in a mega game to make that consistent.
Yeah, it's a huge thing to. It's one of those things that gets compounded immediately once you add the factor that there's 40, 50, 60 people in a room and you've got a dozen or more different people being expected to make decisions. So it's not something that you can entirely solve, but there are a few things that you can consider during the design process for sure, just to try to smooth it out for the players.
Yeah. Another one that I think is great is having very clear facilitator principles. Melbourne Mega Games does a great job of this, where on the back of their facilitator name tags, they have a list of the facilitator guidelines and principles to abide by, so that you can see them right there, and so that you can see, how should I think about decisions in this game? What kind of things should I be considering? Is this meant to be a very pulpy, over the top game where their actions should have these wild, crazy outcomes? Or is this meant to be more of a grounded, serious game where actions should be gritty and, you should have more realistic outcomes for actions? Like, having that really set in stone is very important.
Yeah, for sure. Um, which I think, again, comes down to how you bring your facilitators on board and prep them for the game. I think that's something that can easily be overlooked once you design a game. Get the facilitators along and just say, "Here's the rule book. Read that. Understand what you can do." Slightly more complicated than that. Definitely need to tailor the material that you're giving them and the guidance that you're giving them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of mega games, they write the rule book for the players first, which makes sense. Like, those are the people who really need a rule book. But the rule book for facilitators or GMs sometimes kind of doesn't exist. Like, when you write that first player rule book, you spend a lot of time on it. It's really important. Then it kind of gets closer and closer to the game actually coming out, and you're like, okay, I don't have time to do a full control rulebook on that kind of thing. Which, it's totally reasonable, but it leads to this situation where, essentially the GM guidelines are more in your head, and it's like not necessarily written down and clearly communicated to everyone involved. So
Mm.
that is something I'm reversing in Neverwood. I decided to write the GM control handbook first, which is an experiment. We'll see how that goes, but to make sure that those GM guidelines are really clear, because it is the kind of narrative game that needs them.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting way to approach it. I know that we often talk about in the design group in Sydney about starting the design process about with what are the players doing in the game and on the day. And it's an interesting idea to say, well, what are the facilitators doing? What's their experience like, and
Mm,
what information are they going to need about the game?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Cool. I think let's talk about one that's a classic, which is enemies becoming friends, or enemies to lovers. Maybe that's
Yeah.
the snappy name for it. But going against the briefing, it's a situation where you have these teams that are meant to be at each other's throats, and it's meant to be this grim battle for survival against, all these sharks who are out for blood. And then people come into the mega game and they pretty much immediately make friends. They're
Mm.
pretty much immediately like, "Yep, all right. Oh, we're fighting because you have a hostage of mine. Okay, look, we'll give you that hostage back. We'll give you the thing you wanted. Let's all be friends. Let's not have any conflict." I think this is something that happens quite a bit. When you're making these briefings, you want to have conflict, because that's kind of like, hey, that's what games are usually about, right? Conflict between teams. And so you seed in these little bits of conflict where it's like, oh, these two people want the same resource. These two people care about this thing. These two people are fighting over this thing. Um, but that doesn't always end up actually happening in the game. I think the thing I kind of reflected on as I've seen this happen is that there's actually, in a mega game, it's 6 hours long. There are so many benefits to just being friendly with everyone. Like it is so beneficial to just be friends with everyone.
Mm.
Often in mega games, when you're fighting, you and another player, player A and player B are fighting against each other. Those players are both losing resources and losing actions and losing money and having their stuff blown up, while everyone else is not. Everyone else is getting more money and getting more actions and just being friendly. So fighting each other in a mega game, unless you have actually thought about this and kind of thought about like what actual meaningful rewards are there for fighting and do those outweigh the drawbacks, fighting can often just be kind of really bad for you. Like it can
Mhm.
often lead to like your economy is getting destroyed by being in this war while everyone else is chilling. So yeah, the thing I've kind of reflected on is that if you have this type of conflict, you need to make sure that there is actually a good reason for them to actually pursue that in the game, not just a sentence in the briefing.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's very easy to end up in a situation where, all the generals around the war map all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and have peace forever. And if you don't want that, by the way, that's also an experience that could be what you want, right? Like nothing wrong
Yep.
with that at all. And I think that does create a experience that people enjoy. But yeah, if you don't want that experience, you need to think about why are people actually going to fight each other, and are there enough meaningful reasons for them to do that?
Mm. Yep. I think. Well, firstly, on the sort of kumbayaing, I think what I've learned over the last few years is that the best way to make for really nefarious plots and really vicious sort of rivalries in games, the best way to encourage that is to make a cooperative game. Because people just seem to immediately fall into that kind of stuff when you say from the get go, this is cooperative, everyone's working towards a common goal. People just they can't stand for that. They want to fight. So but I think from a design perspective, what I've learned is it's fine to put this stuff in the briefings, but don't assume that they're not going to stick to it. Assume they will break it. Um, I think briefings are not, and narrative in general, if you're writing some background to the world and you're saying that there's a reason why the two teams have always been enemies and that kind of thing, don't, that's not the place to build conflict. You can put it in for theme, but if you want conflict in the game, a specific type of conflict, it needs to be built in mechanically, I think. There needs to be, like you were saying, Jack, actual benefits to fighting another player or another team that are not just I've always done it or my character has done it in the past or their briefing says one thing and mine says the other. That's not enough when players are in the simulation of the mega game. So I think
Absolutely.
yeah, sowing conflict in different parts of the design is more beneficial than trying to set it up in the briefing.
And I know, by the way, I think this is something that varies a lot based on your local mega game community. My understanding
Hmm.
from talking to people is it seems like the people in the UK are willing to just throw down at the drop of a hat. Like if their briefing says, this person spurned your tea invitation last Tuesday, they'll be like, all right, rest of the game, I'm going to destroy them. But
Well.
at least hey, any UK listeners, call out if that's a incorrect characterization. But my experience of being in a few Australian mega games is that at least the people I've played with are really looking for a very friendly experience. Like, you need to think about who you're actually making this mega game for, obviously. And
Mm.
the people I've played with often they don't necessarily want a lot of conflict. They ideally want to forge strong alliances and relationships and be friendly with each other. And if that's what they want, then the briefing doesn't necessarily matter, which is a good thing in my opinion. Like the briefing, yeah, it's cool. It adds a bit of texture, it gives you goals, but it shouldn't be the be all end all. Otherwise, the player's just copying a script.
Yeah. I think it's tied up. This can be tied up with one of those golden rules, which we often quote, which is sort of setting player expectations, which is a huge. It's a very simple thing to say that encompasses a huge amount of complex sort of work and prep, but you're right about the knowing your audience thing. I know there are some communities where people would get quite pissed off if others go against their brief or do something that is inherently against what their character might do. I think it's more common in the sort of historic mega games or those that have some real world grounding. And I know that in some communities, people will be actively like, they might complain and say this isn't right. That person shouldn't be doing that thing because they're
Mm,
meant to be enemies or something. I don't think
mm,
we have that culture in the Australian scene. Um, I think actually maybe most driven by the fact that a lot of our games are always sort of fantastical and fictional, and not they don't have a lot of lore that they're grounded in. But yeah, it's just worth considering what the player expectations are about those briefs. And my pitch for this one, to keep to the alliteration, is brief breaking. But
ooh, love that. That's nice. Yeah, I think most of the ways I see this happening is people who are meant to be enemies becoming friends. And one of the things I've reflected on over the years is you have to consider how much in a mega game is really incentivizing you to be friends with people. One of the things I think about is you often have a war map in a mega game where all the people who are warlike go to the war map and they spend all their time there and they are meant to be fighting. But you kind of think about it socially, those people who are on the war map with you, they're the people you're spending all the time with. They're the people who you're talking to and, shaking hands and spending all your time greeting, and you're seeing their faces.
mm,
So inevitably, socially, you end up creating a pretty solid relationship with those people, I think. Those are the people you know and can see and can form friendships with. Meanwhile, the people on the council, you've never seen them. You don't know what they're doing. Who knows what they're up to?
mm,
So you're inevitably going to probably form a more antagonist. And, every now and then the council does something that messes with your game and messes up the war map or stops you from fighting or whatever it is. And so, yeah, in my experience, you often end up forming very strong relationships with the people that you're at the same table with, very strong friendships. And the people you're not at the same table with, the council, the spy game, whatever it is, you end up forming antagonistic relationships with them, even when it's not meant to be like that, right? It's not intended that the generals all hate the UN or whatever, but it
mm.
kind of ends up being that way, just because of kind of the social elements in play. Is that whoever you spend your time with at the table together, seeing their faces and seeing them in person, you're probably going to form relationships with those people and friendships with those people compared to the people you never see.
Yeah, and that's one of those lessons that you just need to learn through experience. I think as a designer, there's not a lot you can do about that. So you need to be
Mm,
wary that if you're trying to pitch that a team is going to feel a certain way, a whole team of people feel a certain way about another team. It's you just can't assure that from every member of that team.
mm,
That specifically came through the last time I encountered this as a player was Crisis in Elysium, where it was very much that there was a lot of war mapping happening and a lot of council happening, and the people that I had become friends with and were semi cooperative with at my war map, where I spent most of the day. I would often go back to my table and learn that we were having major issues with them in other war maps, like we were
yep.
literally fighting them. So it just sort of broke down the fact that the teams, each with their own briefing, were united fronts as far as their stance on other people and things. It just wasn't. It didn't sort of play out that way, and I feel like it often
Mm,
doesn't for the reasons that you've said. So
yeah.
I don't know if there's a huge fix, but it's something to be wary of.
I think it just needs. I think one of the big fixes, if you want a game with lots of conflict, is just to make sure that conflict is rewarded in a really meaningful way. And like, getting 1 megabuck is not enough of a reward. Getting a single credit, you need to consider like when people are at war in a mega game, they're probably using lots of resources. They're losing troops. They're getting all their stuff blown up. They're getting it all, destroyed. you need to kind of think of, okay, what is the actual benefit of going into war with someone and being in conflict with someone? And what is the downside of being in conflict with someone? And kind of actually like weigh that up as like, if you want your game to be about conflict and backstabbing and enemy things, those two things, the rewards of being in conflict need to be much higher than the
Mm,
rewards of um not being in conflict, both socially, ideally, and mechanically. Like ideally, you have a situation where it doesn't feel totally terrible to be at war with someone socially. It doesn't feel like, oh, I'm miserable because all my stuff's been blown up. Ideally, it feels fun.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it definitely comes down to knowing the players as well, and letting them know this is what you're in for this game. If you want to come and have a big war game where you're fighting each other, A, make sure the players know that, and B, make sure it's fun and meaningful to fight each other. Um, yeah, I
Mm.
think we solved it.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, look, one of the final, well, not final ones here, but turns and phases blurring together or
Mm,
time management issues. This is a pretty classic one. I think there is an easy solution to this one, but something that tends to pop up is, the war map goes over time. This particular area of the game is going long, and that is causing things to collide together. Mega games are usually run to a pretty strict timer where you have, for example, 15 minutes of action time where people go out and do things and do actions, and 15 minutes of team time where people go to their tables and they talk to their team and they interact. It is important, I think, to a mega game that those things actually happen. It is very easy for people to go, actually, team time isn't that important. I'll just, I'll skip it this turn and I'll just spend more time doing other stuff. It is really beneficial for people to actually sit down with their team and talk about stuff. Otherwise, you end up with this feeling where, for example, if the generals are spending all their time on the war map because the war map is running long, and so they don't actually have time to go back and talk to their team, then they end up not feeling like they have any connection to that team. And they end up not being on that team at all. They're not an Australian general anymore. They're just a general. And you kind of end up with this one super team forming of all the generals because that's the people they're spending all their time with.
mm.
I think this one has an easy fix of just have a turn timer, have it clearly displayed. If you ask around the discords, people have made apps that you can use for this and that kind of thing. But just having something like that is really important, I think.
Yeah, agreed. I think another trick that I have found really useful, and it's becoming more common. It's not for every game, but especially those that have a little bit of admin behind them. Building in some time to the game that is specifically designed for the facilitators to play catch up. Infinite Horizons did this. Did this. I'm not sure if even then it had enough catch up time because it was just such a crunchy game and with so much happening. But giving the facilitators a little bit of downtime that they can use in case things have started to fall over. Um, Beyond that, I think this is a practice thing. It's the more games that you go to, the more that you run, the more that you design, the more you will start to get a good feel of how to manage time well. It's a skill. It's something, again, to work into the briefing and preparation of your facilitators to ensure that they understand not just what needs to be done, but how to do it. And sometimes that can come down to really menial logistical things like how do you lay out the facilitator space? Where's information? Where's components? We've even thought some of our games this past year about what journey does a facilitator take around the game space, and moving things to make that simpler. So all of that kind of stuff, it's worth like the logistics of running a game is definitely worth thinking about. From the facilitator perspective, not just the players. But yeah, I think experience is the biggest one there. You just need to immerse yourself and see why things start running behind.
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is one of the ones where it does have a solution. Maybe it takes, you might find your first mega games struggle with this a little bit, but it will get better. Like there is a way to stop this from happening. It just, yeah, it takes some experience and probably having really clear turn timers and thinking about the facilitators and how much time they need to spend doing things will really help you out with that.
Yeah, for sure. Um, what about news teams, Jack? And
Ooh.
what about when they go a little bit off script and get a little bit bored and start going a bit rogue?
Yeah, the rogue news team. This maybe we
Mm,
call it. I don't. Yeah, I think we can get a snappier name for that. But this is something I see quite often. If you have a news team in your game, a team which is dedicated to spreading information, and lots of mega games have a team like that, where their job is to um, make sure everyone in the mega game knows what has happened. Really classic role, because the reason why this is in there is because in a mega game, so much stuff is happening everywhere. It's hard for people to even know what has happened on the last turn. And so having a role there which is dedicated to, like, hey, this is what happened. This team got blown up last turn. This thing happened over here. This team has done some crazy scheme. We have rumors of mysterious artifacts being discovered in this land. That stuff is really helpful to get some information. And it's also fun, like, sitting down at your table and opening up the newspaper or looking at the Twitter feed and going, oh my God, that team did what? Like, that's really fun and exciting. The problem comes in is that team role of disseminating information is essentially a bit more like a control role than a player role. Players are dedicated to pursuing goals and doing things in the game and trying to, they have goals, they have decisions they need to make in order to achieve those goals. And a news team, if they're just communicating objective information of what happened in the game to their best of their ability, they aren't really making any decisions. They're just like reporting on things, and they
mm,
are not really following a goal. They have a lot of impact on the game, but the more they try to be like a player team, the more they form their own goal and try to make decisions to achieve that goal, the less they are communicating objective information to the rest of the game. They kind of have this thing. It's like the more they're a player, the less they are actually an effective news team. And so what you see happen all the time is a news team will be like, you know what, we have decided to go off script. The lower scale version of this is they decide to be very biased, which I think can work. They decide, actually, we want to make sure this one country wins, for example, or we really support this one measure. We really hate this one thing that's happening. So we'll publish lots of news stories about how much that thing sucks, even if they're not necessarily true. That's like, so that's them making decisions and pursuing a goal, but it is interfering with that control role of making sure people actually know what's happened.
mm,
And then in the extreme cases, you have news teams who end up getting weapons, getting nuclear weapons, seceding off and becoming their own nation state somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, like
mm,
basically becoming a full player team. And,
yeah,
the reason they do that is because, hey, they came to a mega game to make decisions and pursue goals and be a player. And so naturally, it is natural for people to sometimes get a bit bored with the role of imparting objective information and kind of go off and try to become an actual player team.
yeah. And I think you've kind of defined the solution in outlining the problem here as well. Like, just make them a team. Give them some mechanics, give them some resources, give them goals, give them ways to impact the game that makes sense for their function. I would say before all of that, ask yourself why you're having that team. Why does that function need to exist? Is it because it sounds cool and other games have done it and you want that novelty? Or is it because you actually need a funnel of information that flows throughout the game and you're trying to offload that? I think if it's the latter, don't make a team. Just get a facilitator to do that. Try to make sure that the team that you're designing is a meaningful player in the game. Um, I've tried this a few times in the past. One that comes to mind is in Brave New World, which I don't think I nailed it entirely. But in that game, the player, the news, the news team, it had a hierarchy. It had decision making built into it, it also had resources, and those resources were its way of publishing things. So they needed to pay to publish. So the more resources they had, the more they could publish things, and they also needed resources to access parts of the game. So that was a classic game that fell into the three-table trap. So it had a war, it had other miscellaneous, and it had council. And so if the news team didn't have the resources or focus to go to the council, then they wouldn't go there and report on it for a turn. And the way that they got these resources was essentially bribes or lobbying / sponsorships from the teams, the corporations, the nations, that kind of thing. So they needed to go and find those who were willing to pay them, and usually it would be for a good news story in return or something like that. So it gave them a little bit more to do mechanically while they were still effectively writing the headlines and making the little newsletter. Varied success, like I said, but I think they need some substance to it. That you can't just say your function here is to report the news and you can have impact on the game via how you report it. That's not always going to be enough, and I would argue if it's not enough for players, maybe it's not a team that you need. Maybe it's something that the facilitators need to work into how they run things.
Absolutely. And yeah, if it is something that your game just needs that objective news function where it's just people need to know what's happening in the game objectively and the actual things that happened, then it may be that that would be better served by a facilitator role, right? Where it may be that maybe your facilitators just give a short speech about what's happening at the start of each round or things like that. Because, like, let's face it, the control players probably are better suited to that because they have a much better understanding of what's actually happening, like whereas a news team, they're just players. They know about as much as any other player. If they're a player team, then they probably don't have a very good understanding of what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I did the same thing in We Are Not Alone. If anyone is interested in how I tried to tackle the news team in that role, you can check out the free basic rules there. We've posted them around Discords and things like that, but we'll try to have them in the show notes. But in that game, I tried to have two competing news teams, and so they did have resources and conflicts and decisions, but their conflicts and decisions are about beating the other news team. And so it's not like, I want to secede and I want to become my own nation state and blow everyone up and become a player team. It's like they do have things to decide. They're fighting and competing against each other. And if one team gets a bit too biased or whatever, then hopefully the other team is there to give more accurate information. So yeah, the goal was that by having these two teams that are competing, and both giving coverage and both giving things, that you could get an understanding of what's actually happening by looking at both of them.
Yeah. I think if the scale of the game is big enough to justify that, having multiple news teams is always a good way to start, giving them a bit of substance. Yep.
Awesome. I think, yeah, second last one here is safety, welfare, or accessibility failures. I think I've been very lucky that I have not really seen this be a big part of mega games that I've been on. I think, I think this is something that the groups in Australia really care about and spend a lot of time thinking about how to prevent these issues potentially popping up. So yeah, this is not one where I have a lot of stories about horror stories and terrible things that have happened, but inherently mega games are these huge, overwhelming, chaotic experiences, and so it is very important to think about how people are going to experience that and how people are going to go with that kind of thing. So yeah, having very clear welfare guidelines, safety guidelines, anti-harassment guidelines, that stuff is really useful. And having dedicated control people who are focused on safety and welfare of players is really important to avoid any serious problems.
I think just generally, even without a dedicated person, building into your facilitator training or guidance how to manage certain scenarios. Thankfully, I'm in a similar boat, Jack, where I haven't had any major conflicts or issues in that space that we've had to deal with, but I've heard some stories from other groups. setting those expectations with the players is a big thing in this space as well. Not just about the game and what to expect from it, like that whole, it's overwhelming, it's chaotic. I was reminded yesterday, part of my usual introductory speaking points at the start of the game, which James here in Sydney was doing yesterday for So Say We All, is that you won't know what's going on. Don't worry, it's okay. Which is true, and people need to hear that. But as well as that experiential sort of expectation, giving people some guidance on the basic stuff, like make sure you bring some water, make sure you drink and rest throughout the day, make sure you wear good shoes. It doesn't matter if you want to dress up as something cool. You got to be on your feet a lot. So think about that stuff, and think about the fact that the day after the game you might be exhausted. So don't plan a marathon or something.
Yep.
All that kind of stuff for people, especially new players, is really important and really easy to do as well. It's just being thoughtful about where the players are coming from.
Yeah, maybe we could. I know there's some guidelines and things people have done for their mega games. Maybe we could try to find some of those and add them to the episode notes for people to use. But yeah, I would say, yeah, I haven't actually experienced someone who came into a mega game to harass people or anything like that. But one thing that is always a factor is just the overwhelming nature of the event itself. That is something you're always going to have to deal with, and that yeah, you need to make sure that they're one thing we do, for example, is having a dedicated chill out zone where people can go if the event does become overwhelming and they just need a little bit of time to breathe. Like that are really useful to just, yeah, try to make sure that the event is as accessible as possible.
Yeah, for sure. And so that leaves us really with the ultimate mega game paradox. It could be a pet peeve to some, and it could be, saving grace to others. But we did hear from a few people that they really dislike last turn madness, and everything just shit hitting the fan in an incredible way in that last turn or the last moments of the game, where everything
Yep.
just gets dialed up to 10. All the nukes go off. All the Cthulhu's are raised. All the teams attacking each other or spending all of those cards or resources that they save throughout the day. Um, it's it's something we've talked about a bit in the past, and with a few different people who have pretty conflicting views on it. I have to say, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether or not designers should try to avoid it or not. There's definitely a few things that can be done design wise to try to prevent it. But really, I whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's still up to the masses to decide. Where do you stand,
Mm.
Jack?
Well, I think the it is very I think there's two sides to this. One is the narrative side. It is very natural for people to say, "Listen, I've been playing this game for 6 hours. I want it to end with a bang, right? I
Yeah.
want some kind of climactic thing to happen. If I have a goal that I've been putting on the back burner all game, you know what? I better go and make sure that goal happens. That side of things, I think, is good. I mean, the only thing I would say is that ideally you've set up your game so that people don't need to wait till the last turn to do that. But yeah, I mean, hey, ending with some kind of climactic finish makes sense. The thing that I don't like about it is the mechanical side or the resource side. Something that's very typical is
Mm.
the video game problem where you save up all your potions and all your magic items and you're like, I better not use it now, I might need it later. Well, in mega games, you do that and then you get to the final turn and you're like, oh, I have all this stuff that I haven't used all game, I better use it all immediately now. And so everyone ends up using all their resources, all their special abilities, all their cards, all their fancy artifacts and magic spells, and nukes are obviously the very typical example of this. And it all goes off all at once, and it ends up being so many different effects and abilities and
Mm.
things going off that no one knows what is happening. That is not very satisfying.
No.
And so that mechanical side of things, that is something I try to tackle in my designs. Like, I think ideally, for example, you might make it so that you need to use your stuff. You can't just save it for the final turn, use it or lose it.
Yeah.
Or you have something like that that encourages people to actually do stuff and not just hoard it for the last turn.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a common fix for that. Another is don't tell them when it's ending. Don't
Mm,
tell players that it's going to be over next turn. That one you know, that one can lead to the bad feels because people will say, "Well, we were planning this thing and we thought we had one more turn, and now we can't do it, so we've wasted the
mm,
last few turns." Um, I don't know what the answer is there. I feel like basically you can't please everyone in this scenario. Some people are going to want a certain ending, and some others want specifically don't want that ending.
mhm.
And it's hard to satisfy everyone. I think, yeah, it's a paradox I don't think we can ever solve. And
No.
it might be, again, something that in design you need to think about and consider how will I communicate to my players the way that this game ends? Should they all know it's going to end at a certain time? Or should they all know that doing X, Y, and Z near the end of the game might be a bad thing to do? I'm not sure. How you communicate the theme and the kind of uh, vibe of the game is probably something that will guide this a little bit.
Yep, and I think setting expectations and guidelines for your players can really help with this. Deep Haven, for example, has a list of player principles, like things for players to keep in mind when they're playing. And the first one is, I think the first one is first turn madness. Don't wait till the last turn. That crazy plan, that scheme you've got, do it now. Let's not stick around here. Let's make sure it actually happens straight up. And so, yeah, if you are doing that system, if you are going to do a thing where it's not totally clear when the game is going to end, I think
Mm,
it's a good idea to just tell people that up front. Like, hey, if you've got that big plan you really want to do it now. Do it first turn. Get going. Like, let's have some drama here. Let's have some stuff happen. Just make sure that they're aware. If they leave it to the last minute, it may not happen because the game timer may run out at an unknown interval. So yeah, setting expectations is really the key.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's our list. We've covered a lot of different pet peeves and bugbears, and hopefully have given some of you thoughts on how to tackle some of these things that you particularly don't enjoy in mega games. I know for me, there's a lot of these things that can be navigated, I think, through the design process, and I'll definitely be keeping them in mind for future designs. We did have a few others that we don't have a lot of time to run through in detail, but just shouting out a few people who did respond to us. A couple of the pet peeves people have was sort of just the energy, the energy loss for running a mega game, that you sort of run out of steam and miss something cool. I know that that's something that ties into Last Turn Madness as well. I was actually guilty of this yesterday. We had Last Turn Madness with So Say We All, and during the final big battle, I was kind of sitting down a lot and just chilling and waiting to hear what happened because I was cooked. And other components and game pieces that don't actually carry a mechanical weight. So the obligatory things that when you're writing the rules and the theme of the game makes it feel like they should be there, but they don't actually matter. That's a big one, and a common trap, I think. Similar game components or sort of parts of the game that just have you standing around watching something happen.
Mm.
I know that can happen in some games, war maps and that kind of thing. People having, I guess the crux of that is limited decision making. So you make one decision and then you observe the outcomes of it for a phase of the game. I think it's pretty self-explanatory how that can maybe not be super exciting. And then we also heard the peeve of games not being published enough,
Ah,
which I can
yes.
I can get behind for sure. Getting more games out into the community and cross fertilizing the game space, the game design space, I think is a pet peeve for a few, and something that I think we do try to address with this podcast, and hopefully we can continue to in the years to come. And then finally, there was a comment about flexibility and adhering too strongly to the rules, which I think we kind of touched on a little bit, just
Mm.
about the discretion of facilitators and how they make decisions and how they enforce the rules. But yes, it's common frustration and pet peeve people can have if a game For example, game experience I've had, and I know it was a bit of critique from other players, was a game where people were coming up with ideas and like new things that they wanted to try, and the response from the facilitators was kind of like, there's a card in the game that does that. You have to find the card, and sort of not having flexibility to the rules to
Right.
do
Yeah.
things. Yeah. So common pitfall, worth keeping in mind when you're designing your next mega game.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I hope that it's been clear that this list is not to say never do these things or these things are always bad. It's just to hopefully bring anyone who's a new designer or who who may not have considered some of these things up to speed on what the discussion is and the fact that these things are being thought about and have been thought about by other designers and
Mm.
kind of like think about, yeah, hey, this is a thing that some people have problems with. But it may be the best choice for your game. Lots of people love Last Turn Madness and having the nukes go off. Lots of people love elements where, for example, the economy goes rapidly out of control and everyone ends up very rich. That can be really fun, like
Yeah.
there are like these things are not to say you have to do this or you can't do this. It's just when you're designing your stuff, be aware that these are things that people have thought about before and that people may not enjoy.
I think that wraps us up then. Hopefully, you have learned something from all of this, and we would love to hear from anyone, in the Discord or via the socials. If you have any other pet peeves that we haven't talked about, or any ideas about how to navigate some of the ones that we've gone through, anything you disagree with us on, any other ways to better address these things through the design, always keen to hear from you. So reach out, join the Discord, join the conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for listening.
See you next time.